I was in Italy once, and this Italian woman said, she found out my surname, and she said, do you know that it means in Italian to drink the milk of the mother's breast? Which is pretty much as good a pickup line as I've ever heard. Where do you go from there? When I was growing up, my musical tastes were pretty pedestrian. I think the first album I ever bought was the Partridge Family. And I still sort of like those manufactured groups. I mean, I love the Monkees, for instance. Sylvania Hotel, Caringbah Hotel, Northies down at Cronulla were all favourite venues for some of the famous Australian rock bands of that period. You could go to the Police Citizens Boys Club and see AC/DC, or a little later In Excess, or Cold Chisel. I lived a couple of streets away from the Bondi Lifesaver, which was a primo venue for music back in those days. But I used to drop in on Monday nights when it was sort of like industry night. So you would see at the bar the members of Little River Band or Sherbet or Ted Mulry, for instance, drinking with all their muso mates. So that was a lot of fun. I used to go to the Mansell Room, which was another great live music venue, and I was on the cusp of the time when the Whiskey A Go-Go in William Street was big, but that closed not long after I got to the inner city. I lived around the inner city for probably until about the late 80s when I got married. Then moved to Riverwood, then moved to Marrickville, then moved to Enmore, and lived in a street down the side of the Enmore Theatre, about 20 seconds away from the front door of the Enmore Theatre, particularly with a good friend of mine who used to invite me to see particular concerts when he always got free tickets. But he had a poor sense of organisation. So instead of telling me ahead of time, giving me some sort of warning, I'd get a telephone call about 5 minutes to 8, saying, oh, listen, I've got tickets for such and such up at the Enmore, do you want to come up? And I could say, yes, I'll be there in 20 seconds. In 1979, I became a journalist, and then a magazine editor, and worked on a number of different business publications, including a couple about corporate travel. So I got to travel a lot for about a 15-year period. That was a lot of fun. And this is how I got to meet Glenn, who is Glenn A. Baker. And if you haven't heard of Glenn, you either live in Melbourne or you probably need to get onto Google and check out his Wikipedia entry. But basically, for Sydney, Glenn A. Baker is the Molly Meldrum of Sydney. He's a band manager. He pretty much masterminded Old 55, which in the 70s was a retro Happy Days type rock and roll act, which was huge for some reason. He worked with a lot of record companies. He's put together about 800 different recording projects, compilations for record companies. He also partly owned Raven Records, which was a reissue company. And he was on television, he was on the radio, he did Qantas in-flight programs. He's been pretty much everywhere for about since the 70s. But he had a radio program on Triple M in Sydney called Back to the Future. And it was Sunday mornings, and if you know Glenn, he's got this voice, which is a trademark radio voice, and a way of introducing his subjects and telling stories that sort of suck you in. And so every Sunday morning, 10 o'clock I think it was, on Triple M, he would introduce a special 1 hour documentary about a band or an artist. And I would listen every Sunday morning, being a music fan, and I'd think, gee, I'd love to talk to this guy about music, and it'd be such a blast. Well, it ended up being that when I was editing these corporate travel magazines, I'd be sent away on these trips to far-flung destinations. And sometimes Glenn would actually be also along on these. They were called familiarization trips, they were called, but famils. And Glenn would often be a participant as well. So I'd get to talk to him, and we got along really, really well. And we'd invariably end up in record stores or CD stores in LA or Hong Kong or Tokyo or somewhere. And going to a record store with Glenn A. Baker is an experience. You're usually there for a few hours. Sometimes you get to buy something, but often it's just Glenn moving along each row, flicking through albums and pulling one out and going, the cleaner of the studio next door to the studio where this was recorded was actually the brother-in-law of the guy who, and it would go on like this for hours on end. But it was fascinating stuff. And he knew everybody, he'd interviewed everybody, he was friends with everybody, and he'd have these marvelous stories. But then when I fell into Glenn's orbit and I got to visit his archive, which is enormous, could be 40 to 50,000 LPs, for instance. Singles, CDs, 78s, reel-to-reel tapes, plus ephemera, photos, press releases, press kits, the giveaways that record companies hand out to journalists to promote things. And often, rule of thumb for this is, the more elaborate the giveaway, the less likely the band is to be remembered 10 years down the track. Maybe around about the same time as I met Glenn, this was the period of Napster and file sharing. So through various computer sources, I collected a huge number of MP3s, for instance, and then got into iPods and sort of, I still got iPods. I had an iPod in my car. I had a travel iPod that I always take away and play in whatever hire car I had. Somewhere around 85,000 songs, mainly 60s and 70s. Being a journalist is very much being an outsider. You're always looking in. So you get to interview musicians and people in the music industry, but there's always this little barrier because you don't quite know exactly what they do, but you do know it's some particular type of magic that they're able to call up. And perhaps it's the same way that you can write stories. I've sort of fallen into the role of archivist, and Glenn's had a lot of archivists over the years. An archivist is actually a fancy word for cleaner, because Glenn is fairly disorganized, but with the millions of items that he actually has, he generally knows exactly what he's got and a fair idea of where it is. So he'll be able to pull it out if he needs it to research an article or do liner notes, and he's done hundreds of liner notes over the years. I've written one set of liner notes in my time. But he's not terribly good at putting things back. So my job as archivist is basically to clean up the mess. And when I'm cleaning up the mess and I'm going through things that he sort of put aside, I'll find stuff that I go, oh shit, we should put this somewhere special. And it'll even come down to master tapes of particular records. And you go, there's not many of these around. So you just put it aside and hope that sooner or later that it doesn't disappear. And I worked for about 10 years for News Limited for their publishing division. And then after that got into business publishing and was a business travel writer and magazine editor. But in those first 10 years, I worked on I was a writer for encyclopedias. So I'd get a list, at the beginning of every week, I'd get a list of subjects to write about, and I would go off to the State Library of New South Wales in the city and sit in reading rooms and research stuff and turn it in and get paid. That sort of led to a number of books being published. So I published about 6 or 7. So there's been 6 or 7 commissioned and paid for. And I think 5 of those eventually got published. But yeah, and they were all non-fiction, mainly to do with Australian history. Because in those days when I was writing for encyclopedias, it was in the lead up to the bicentennial in 1988. So every publisher was falling over themselves to publish Australian history. So I've done 2 books on Australian architecture, one on crime fiction, Australian crime fiction, and a book on country music, which was the last one, and a company history of a insurance company.
Wow.
But hell, you go where the money is when you're a writer. I did have a girlfriend at one time whose flatmate worked for the Seabull Townhouse, which was the place where everybody stayed back in the 70s. All the big music acts stayed at the Seabull Townhouse in King's Cross. And so she worked at the Seabull, and she'd always get tickets. So one night we got tickets, I think, to Lou Reed at the Hordern Pavilion, and the support band, which we went and saw, and we had front row tickets. And I remember watching the support band for about 10 minutes and turning to my girlfriend and saying, this band's not terribly good. I mean, look at the guitar player. He just sort of stands there and plays and has no expression. And this guy in a dinner suit, you know, I don't think this band is ever going to go anywhere. And they're called the Angels. I mean, really. So that was part of my introduction to music industry prophecy. I was very, very good at that. I went to a Monday night, completely going off topic here, a Monday night tryout night at the Mansell Room in King's Cross. And there was a band on, and I remember turning to a friend of mine and saying, this band's not terribly good. You know, having a name like Men at Work, I mean, what sort of band name is that? They'll never go anywhere. Prophecies once again. Anyway, so I did actually get to see the Angels fairly early on, but I hadn't actually seen them. I'd played a lot of their records, of course, but at this particular evening at the Enmore Theatre, It was a benefit concert for Doc. By that time, he had announced that he had cancer, and like a lot of these guys, they got no money, even if they write all the songs, which I'm not sure that Doc did write the songs. But anyway, had no money, and his health was deteriorating. And so everybody in the music industry got together, performers, and it was a great concert. So backstage, because I went with Glenn, we were backstage, and I actually got to talk to Doc. And he was a really nice guy. I was glad I did. It wasn't too long after that concert that Doc died, which is a great shame. And that was one of the great things about going to concerts with Glenn, is that we would end up backstage afterwards, and we'd get to meet these people. And I remember the first time I actually went to one of the Enmore Theatre concerts with Glenn, just after I'd moved to Enmore. And it was Suzi Quatro. Now, Suzi Quatro's toured Australia dozens of times. And Suzi Quatro was big when I was growing up, of course. Can the Can, all those early songs of hers. But I don't think I'd ever been to a Suzi Quatro concert. But I knew all the songs, of course, from listening to the radio. So anyway, we went to this concert, and the thing that struck me about the entire thing, and which hadn't really occurred to me before, dumb, is that this was like going to church. It was like going to a Hillsong. There were just everybody, like the entire audience was worshipping Suzi Quatro, somebody they had listened to 30 years before. And now they were old people like me, and they were reliving their youth. And we went backstage, and Suzi had just come off stage after a couple of hours, drenched in sweat. You could tell how tired she was. But she made time to talk to everybody, whether they were old friends or fans that had seen her 50 times or something, and just got lucky enough to get backstage. Or somebody like me who'd never met her before, and she had no idea who I was. But she was nice enough to just take the time to listen. And she was just nice. And that sort of thing has happened quite a lot. We went to a Phil Collins concert. Now, this was the last concert that he actually did in Australia, which is a couple of years back now. But Phil, by that time, was pretty sick. He'd had his back problems because of being a drummer, and obviously a very percussive drummer, and damaged his back, had nerve damage, etc., etc. So he couldn't stand, so he spent the entire concert in a chair, and it was his son who was the drummer for his band. And so at particular times his son would do a drum solo, and Phil would sit on a chair nearby and just watch him. So anyway, we went backstage afterwards. This was out at Homebush, so it was a pretty big concert. And we got to meet Phil's son and a couple of members of the band. I think Leyland Sklar was also in the band. Glenn was very excited to meet him. And a couple of the backup singers who were really nice, who'd visited Australia before with various other acts that had come to Australia. And then at the end, just as we're leaving, Phil was in a wheelchair, and he was being guided out by one of his assistants. And so we wandered over and just introduced ourselves and said hi and everything else. And he was wiped. He was so tired, but he was nice enough to take the time to talk to fans. And each of these times that I've met these sort of people that have played a part in my musical development as a fan, I've sort of always made the point of saying, thanks for all the enjoyment that you've given me, and thanks for your music, basically, which is a bit of a cliche, but I think it's worth saying. I'd convinced Glenn that he should do a Paul Williams thing. Now, Paul Williams in the 1970s was big as much for being a songwriter, and he wrote songs for the Carpenters, We've Only Just Begun and Rainy Days and Mondays. He wrote Evergreen for Barbra Streisand. A number of other songs. He wrote the theme for The Love Boat, for instance. But he was also an actor. And he was an actor first and then became a songwriter. But then he went on to act in a heck of a lot of 70s TV shows, like he was on The Love Boat, Smokey and the Bandit. He was in all 3 Smokey and the Bandit movies. I did a telephone interview because I wrote the liner notes for the this greatest hits thing. So I talked to Paul by telephone a few times in putting together the notes for this this album. And the next time I was in the States, because I used to travel across there a lot, I actually lucked upon the time when he was doing a show in Vegas. So I went to his concert, and then afterwards got to meet him and have a chat to him and spend some time with him and his backup band, who had been working with him for like 30 years and remembered coming to Australia back in the 70s when he used to play the Sydney Hilton circuit, which they had a sort of supper club type of thing going in the 70s. So a lot of American acts would actually come across and do Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, etc. Now, Paul Williams in the 80s, and he won't mind me saying this, because most of the music industry and certainly most of the film industry in the 1980s in California had drug problems, drug and alcohol problems. The story that he tells about how he came to write Evergreen for Barbra Streisand is that Streisand was filming A Star Is Born with Chris Christopherson. And I think this was the second remake of Star Is Born, and then there's been a more recent remake of A Star Is Born. Anyway, she was starring in this. And Paul, in the midst of his sort of drug funk, remembers getting a phone call from Streisand, and she wanted him to write a song for the film. What he actually heard when she called is that, oh, hi, this is Barbara, I want you to write the entire soundtrack for the movie. So he sat down and wrote 14 or 20 songs, and a couple of weeks later delivered them all. They used a few songs. However, Evergreen, and this is the 1970s, so I think this is the first time it actually happened, the song won a Grammy, a Golden Globe, and an Oscar. So that's pretty good when you're in the middle of a drug habit and you can produce something like that. He actually became a drug counsellor. So, and he admits himself that when he was famous, he was probably a bit of a monster. But these days, he's the nicest, kindest guy who will do anything for people. And he was just a delight to talk to. So sometimes meeting your heroes can be a good thing. All-time favorite album. Once again, I mean, I'm not terribly esoteric when it comes to this sort of thing, but silk degrees, Boz Scaggs, that was part of my 70s, and that sort of West Coast yacht rock, they call it yacht rock.
First concert you ever went to?
Gary Glitter. I was still in high school, and I took this girl from high school, and it was at the Hordern Pavilion, and yeah, I don't remember anything about it.
If you could go and see any band or artist, past or present, tonight, who would it be?
Oh, very good question. Okay, it would probably have to be Roxy Music, but early Roxy Music, like the first 5 albums of Roxy Music.
Beatles or Stones?
Stones.
Hendrix or Clapton?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'd have to say Hendrix, because Clapton was great early on, and then as he got older, nah.
Hagar or Lee Roth?
Neither.
That's a great answer. Frida or Agnetha?
Who was the blonde?
Agnetha.
Ah, okay. Agnetha.
Dance floor or seated?
Seated.
Fender or Gibson?
Probably Fender's got cooler t-shirts.
iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Beer or something else?
I'm not a big beer drinker. 2 is about my limit. If it was spirits, I was a huge vodka fan, but probably bourbon these days. Ice, that's it.
MTV or Rage?
Rage.
Vinyl or streaming?
Oh, come on, vinyl.
Stairway to Heaven or Bohemian Rhapsody?
Bohemian Rhapsody.
It's 1 a.m. You've seen a band. You've had a few drinks. It's almost time to head home. What's your kebab order?
Ah, okay. Well, I'd have a beef gyros with onion and barbecue sauce. That's it, nothing else.
Where do you see yourself in 5.5 years?
Oh, I don't know, probably in a wheelchair dribbling on myself. Hi, I'm David Latta, and you can find my story at the Australian Rock and Roll Museum.